Hello, everyone, and welcome to Inclusion Starts Now, the podcast. I am just so excited for this episode. I got to interview Blair Fell. He is the author of The Sign for Home, which I read while I was working within the deafblind community. And he did such a phenomenal job just showing so many different areas in the disabled world. And I wanted to know his background and the inspiration behind his characters. And he wrote a second book that comes out this year. And we've been friends like on Instagram, and I reached out and he said yes. And I seriously feel like I could have hung out with him all weekend just talking to him about literally everything. So here is our conversation. Before we get to that, let's get to our sponsor. Today, I'm going to say our sponsor is small bookstores like local bookstores. Um, Mainly because my local bookstore in Camas, Washington, called Bookish, they sell my books, Tyler the Snake, Dallas the Dog, and Miguel the Chameleon. And they also sell really cute things like the Mystic Cats tarot cards. I do a very fun, chill reading at the end of my podcast episodes. And the last few have been so good. I have to talk about it right now. Um, they're fun. They keep things, fun. And that was me describing a really great thing in a very simple way. So come enjoy my conversation with Blair. Blair, thank you so much for doing this and working with my sporadic schedule. I really appreciate you.
Not a
Can
problem.
you introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Blair Fell. I'm the author of two novels so far. One, the first is called The Sign for Home, and the second, which is coming out May 6th, is Disco Witches of Fire Island.
So I met you. I mean, this is our first time meeting virtually, which I'm just like so happy that you said yes to doing this. Um, but it was because of your book, The Sign for Home, and I can't even remember the first. I mean, I was working in the deafblind field, and so when that book was being advertised, I was just like, oh my gosh, a book that has a deafblind character. And I mean, I just wanted to know everything about it. So before I talk about the stuff that I know about the book, can you give people just like a summary of the sign for home?
Sure. So the essence of the book, even though it's advertised as a romance, it's really not a romance. It's more of a coming of age story about a young, straight, deaf-blind man and his friendship with his gay interpreter, who they meet one summer and they bit by bit realize that something is not right with how his family's allowing information to be passed on to this young man, and that there is a lost love of the young man, this young deaf woman, and it's about this young man and his interpreter and their friendship and how they go on a journey to find out what happened to this young woman, girlfriend of the deaf-blind man. That's, I think, basically it.
So what inspired the characters?
Well, I mean, I've been a sign language interpreter for 30 plus years now. It was like my survival job that I started when I started becoming a writer. And I had learned sign language when I was in college. I was going to Catholic University in DC, and I fell in love with my straight best friend, and I was heartbroken. So I transferred to Gallaudet, which is a deaf college in DC, as a special student. And so I lived among the deaf for a bit, and I learned some sign language prior to that. I had to be screened before I could be accepted to Gallaudet, and then just kind of improve my skills and live with deaf people. And I had amazing deaf teachers and that. But so I became an interpreter in my late 20s when I started writing, and so this isn't based on any other than myself, any real deaf, blind, or deaf people because that would be unethical. But it's about like similar experiences that I've had as an interpreter, like when you go into a hospital and how nurses will always be like, "Well, I'm just writing back and forth to the deaf person." Like, do you know if they can read? I mean, do you know if they have language deprivation and all of that? Oh, well, I'm sure they can read lips. Like these
Yeah.
assumptions that are like wrong. And like when I was young, I blew up a lot when I was young. And like you see this happen with the interpreter in the book. I'm much better now. I know how to be a little bit more diplomatic when I'm talking or doing cultural mediation. Like if I'm working with a deaf person that, fully knows their rights, is educated, I just like hand it off to them. They'll deal with the hearing person. But often in New York, especially, I'll be dealing with people that maybe only learn sign language. They're deaf, but they came from Uganda and they only learned sign language like 3 weeks ago. Not like that, but I mean, maybe a couple of years before, and they don't know about their rights. And I'll be like, hey, do you mind if I talk to this hearing person and explain that you need X, Y, and Z? Is that okay with you? You check with the deaf person, and they'll be like, go for it, please. And then you kind of do a diplomatic interface like, oh, hey, just talk straight to the deaf person. You don't need to tell me to tell them. Just talk to them. I'm your voice. I'm their voice for you. And
Yeah.
doing all that, within, educated, they just handle all of that. But anyway, so it's all these experiences uh, that at a certain point when I started working on this idea, I mean, there were a couple of events that inspired me to write this particular story. Uh, One was my own experience when I first worked with deafblind people. Like the character in the story, I was just thrown in there like, oh, is deafblind? Just go. I'm like, I know
Yeah.
how you work with a deafblind person.
And that is
And
extremely, that happens a lot. That,
yes,
yeah.
they just throw you in there. You're an interpreter. And you do it, and what's amazing, and we do tactile sign language, which is hand over hand. This was what I did when I first did it, maybe
Yeah.
in the mid 90s, might have been the first time I encountered my first deaf blind person. And they're like comprehending things through your hands, and you're like, I ain't that good of an interpreter. What the hell is going on? How is this person getting all this from what I'm signing? And it was like incredible. And so many of the deafblind people I've worked with since are so brilliant and just can intuit things and sense things through the interpreting process that is just amazing to me. And I've become friends with some over the years. And then with this book, what I did was I interviewed probably about 9 deaf-blind people to because this book again it's a love story, not a romance, but it's a
Yeah.
love story and a friendship story. And I just was like, one, I would ask them, what is the most frustrating thing that happens from the hearing community to you or from the interpreting community in you? I'd ask them, tell me about the first time you fell in love, what it is that you fall in love with, what do you eroticize, tell me your love stories. Uh, and they would share this stuff with me, and it was really, really interesting and very diverse. It
Yeah.
wasn't a monolith. Uh, a lot of the deaf blind people, the vast majority of the deaf blind people that I work with now and have worked with over the years have something called Usher syndrome 1,
Hmm.
which is uh, I forget the kind of genetic syndrome it is, but both parents have to have the gene, so it's very rare that someone will be born with this. But they're generally it expresses itself differently, and like the onset of on excuse me, what's the word? It's
Like
morning
the
here too.
onset of
Thank you.
a
I'm like
vision.
the onslaught. No, the onset. I'm a writer. I'm not really a speaker. Anyway, the onset of like blindness, the retinitis pigmentosa, which is what
Yeah.
causes the blindness, doesn't always happen at the same time. Generally, when they're a little kid, they'll experience night blindness. They'll bit by bit they'll start like losing their peripheral vision, and then at a certain point they may or may not. It might just stop progressing, but at a
Yeah.
certain point they may completely lose the vast majority of their sight, or it'll be this tiny little speck of clear vision in this like massive like ghost vision uh kind of thing. So often like a friend of mine, he lost his sight. He was deaf since birth, lost his sight about 4 years ago. fully lost his sight.
Hmm.
Started losing sight at an early age, bit by bit, but fully went blind about 4 years ago. And and just like that idea of how it's not just like one, it's not like certain other disabilities where like they have the disability and that's kind of the what the disability is like for the rest of their lives, and that's just how things are. With Usher syndrome 1, there's several mourning processes that go through. It's like, oh, I lost this amount of peripheral vision. I have to, do these things so I can, function. Oh, I just lost more, maybe 4 years later, 5 years later, 10 years
Yeah.
later. And sometimes the loss happens overnight, and then they have to relearn how to get through the world with that loss. And all of that was like interesting to me. And
And that was what
like,
your main character had, right? He was diagnosed
yes,
with Usher
yes,
syndrome.
Usher syndrome 1, correct. He lost his vision way earlier. Like most of my friends that to the point of like where they're not really depending on their sight very much at all, kind of more their 40s or 50s,
Yeah.
sometimes 30s, but I know people like in their 20s that are, basically fully blind,
Yeah.
and we're born deaf. So that is like with the main character, but he lost his very early on, and so he does know Braille. But he can see a little bit if he enlarges the letters on the screen. And that's the other thing with the hearing and sighted world, or just the sighted world, because not all deaf people understand this. Like blind isn't like, oh, suddenly I don't see anything. Boom.
Yeah.
It's there's just such a range of that and what that means uh, for this character. Another thing that impacted me and was an inspiration for this book was years and years and years ago. I was working in a hospital with a person who was younger, who something happened to, and I want to be just really vague about this.
Yeah.
And they had a huge physical disability that happened, and no one knew why it happened. The therapist had a theory of how this accident happened, but they didn't know, and the person wasn't talking, and the person was very suspicious of me at first, and then they saw me do the things that I just explained by doing cultural mediation with the nurses, like don't assume this person knows how to read. I checked in
Yeah.
with them. They actually say their reading is this. I'm shaking my hand like meza meza. When a
Yeah.
deaf person does that, that means pretty much they don't read. Often has been my experience that the reading is very weak. They assume that this person let red lips. And this has happened over and over again. But this person, I was intrigued by like the not knowing of what happened to this accident. And then years later, and also this person started checking in with me. They're like, "Are you gay?" I'm like, "That's a strange question." And bit by bit, this person revealed their sexuality to me, and they just really appreciated me being there.
Yeah.
And I felt close to them. Years passed, and they reached out for me from a nursing home, um, in another state, and and it just like really impacted me and touched me about like that, which kind of played into the character. Like when
Yeah.
you're doing these things, you fantasize like, God, if I was not an interpreter and I could be a more use to this person, how could I be of a better benefit to this person?
Yeah.
What could I do that stretched the boundaries of ethics? Like how could I punch this nurse out for being so disrespectful? Not my
Yeah.
job. Deaf person's job to punch them out or not punch them out. But it's just like you do have these.
Uh,
I have these fantasies, and like in certain ways, the sign for home is an actualization of some of those fantasies. And when I was a younger interpreter, I would get in trouble a lot because I would become impolite to the able-bodied uh, person sometimes, and I would get back home and I get a call from the agency saying, "Hey, you can't scream at the nurses," stuff like that. But and I learned that that's also bad for the deaf too, and it's bad for the deaf or deaf blind because people always assume what once you tell them, "Hey, I'm just your voice, I'm their voice." So if I say something, they're like the deaf person just is doing that. So
Yeah.
it's like you have to be representing the deaf person as they want to be represented. And that's really important to be respectful of. I was a young interpreter, did not really have training, because New York, we don't have licensure. And so they'll just throw anyone
Oh, really?
out there. Yeah, it's awful. It's awful.
Wow.
Uh, yes. So I've had like, I mean, I didn't take really hard jobs when I was new. Most of the jobs, like I think he talks a little bit about it, the main narrator in the book, Cyril, about like, or maybe there's another new book I'm working on that they talk about it. Most of my jobs were in custodial training programs for like the first 11 years of my interpreting. That's
Yeah.
what I would take because one, it gave me a lot of downtime to write, but also no one was dying if I fucked up an interpretation. It's
Yeah.
like, put that pad on the bottom of the buffer. The
Yeah.
champagne is for polishing the floor, the black pad is for scrubbing and stripping, stuff like that. No one's gonna die, but also you still check in as an
I mean,
interpreter.
someone might slip and fall.
Yes, no, someone could die. No, it is actually serious because it's their career and
Yeah.
it's their life. So it is serious, but it wasn't like, later jobs I took where I'm on the floor of a operating room looking up, lying on my
Wow.
back, interpreting to someone who's face down getting spine surgery. Uh,
Wow.
I wouldn't take those jobs early on, but I've been in jobs as an interpreter where they put a team with me. Like this happened once, but it was the most egregious version of it. It was like a fairly high level deaf person, and the team sat down and it was like their turn. They go on to sign and they turned to me and said, "What's the sign for city?" City. They didn't know the sign for city. That's how much they didn't even know sign language, much less
Yeah.
they weren't really an interpreter.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
it's conceivable that that could happen in a state that doesn't have licensure. So yeah. Anyway, so
Yeah.
all those things, that's what like kind of inspired the book. No one specific thing. It's all kind of out of my imagination, but
Yeah.
most of the circumstances or things you've either heard about or experienced yourself as far as the kind of microaggressions, real aggressions, oppressions that happen to both the deaf blind, and the interpreter.
Yeah. I have so many questions and I just okay, so I was trying to write them down. I did want to talk a little bit about Usher syndrome because so I was working with Helen Keller National Center, which is on the East Coast, but I was working with a California team. So I was working with a lot of adults um, who are who are deafblind. But then I also was working part-time for California Deafblind Services, where I was working like with families who might get like a new diagnosis for deafblindness. And a lot of it was Usher syndrome because after after child was like deaf or hard of hearing, they then did genetic testing, and one of the things they tested for was Usher syndrome. So all of a sudden, these, like I would say the last 10 years, more kids have been getting an Usher syndrome diagnosis, and everyone's like, so are they going to lose their vision? Like now we don't know because now we're actually like we now know to do this genetic testing. So now we're going through this like area of like, okay, do we teach them Braille or do we just make sure they can write and we're going to learn Braille later? Like, should we teach them how to walk with a white cane or like should we wait for them to like lose some of their peripheral?
Mhm.
Because now we don't really know how many people are deaf and hard of hearing out in the world and maybe they have lost some vision, but maybe it's not a lot. Like we kind of don't know now how many more people are going to be diagnosed with Usher syndrome, which I
Right.
think is really interesting. Um, but one of my favorite things that I love to tell people because I worked with a lot of families who, I mean, they were mourning that they were really, they first had to accept that their child was like deaf or hard of hearing and having to, do they learn sign language and all that area. And then getting a diagnosis of Usher syndrome, it was a lot of, it was like kind of going through the 7 stages of grief. And I love to tell people because I worked with both groups that I'm like, oh, well, I know plenty of adults who are deafblind who are married and have kids and have jobs and live independently. Like, yeah, they might get some support, but they have found ways to live independently with their support system. And I have some friends who are not deafblind and, living at home with their parents, like can't keep a job, like struggling to have relationships. So, like
Right.
and I don't know how helpful that was to them at that time, but it was always this process of like, just because there is a disability, it doesn't mean that they can't live like a fulfilling, happy life. Um, which I want to bring back to you going to Gallaudet University, because that is so cool that you like how I guess I don't know how many hearing people go there.
Well, it's different now because hearing people are allowed to go, I believe, undergraduate now there. I'm actually not sure. I mean, you can record that. I just don't know. I just know that more hearing people go there than did when I was there. When I was there, hearing undergraduates were not allowed to go. I believe there were some hearing graduate students, but undergraduate, you had to be deaf or hard of hearing. And among the special students, I think there were 8 of us, and one of them was actually deaf but raised oral, and she wanted to go to the deaf world for a while, and it actually changed her life in a
Yeah.
kind of funny way because she was an A student at a hearing college, and she went for a semester to Gallaudet and was like, "Oh my God!" And she signed terribly. She signed like a hearing person, but
Yeah.
she just like fell in love with being among people that spoke in a visual language and were deaf like her. And she started going out every night, partying for the first time. Her grades plummeted,
Oh my
and
gosh.
but she transferred to Gallaudet because she was like, "I'm with my people." Her name was Heidi. She was so cool. Um, and the rest of us were hearing, and that was so there was only 8 of us at the time. So I don't know what it is now, but back then it was like you had to be deaf or hard of hearing unless you were this study abroad in the deaf world student
Yeah.
among this small cohort. Yeah, there was something I wanted to say about there's also a wonderful book if you haven't read it called Touch the Future by John Lee Clark.
No.
Oh, I cannot recommend
Oh
this book
no.
enough. If you really want to know more about the protactile movement and about deaf blindness, John Lee Clark is basically the poet laureate of deaf blind people, but he's also an amazing essayist. And so it's
Yeah.
called Touch the Future by John Lee Clark. Devour it. It is an amazing book. He's one of the people I interviewed for the Sign for Home, but he's brilliant and a brilliant writer. And this book really in an extremely brazen, empowering way is like, okay, let's deal with your distancism is a word that he uses. It's a word in the deafblind world, meaning, hearing sighted people or sighted people's not wanting to be touched. And
Yeah.
touch is the main language for the deafblind. And so he goes into distancism. He goes into like when people are, physically describing themselves. He's like, I don't need to know the thread count of your sweater. Just like keep it short, all right? Where
Yeah.
people are like, I'm wearing this and this jade colored pendant on that. It's like, I don't want to know all that. Keep it
Yeah.
short, get to the content. And it's just this amazing book. And then really goes into the history of protactile. Have you talked about that much on your show?
No, I mean, I've talked a little bit about it. I talked about it a lot during Deaf Blind Awareness Week this last year because that whole thing that Helen Keller wasn't real. So I did a lot of videos going over that she was real, and then I talked about how people who are deafblind can be educated and communicate. And I talked about it because yeah, they do. Like there was this podcast where someone was like making fun of Anne Sullivan, uh, like doing the finger spelling like in her hand,
Uh-huh.
and like saying that people can't communicate that way. Like they were just like, yeah, I think that they were like kind of like discarding it, and I was like, no, that's a real thing. It's
Oh, it's like, well,
protest
that's
action.
tactile versus like protactile, which is is
It's
something out of the deafblind world itself. So protactile might be
it's
on
like
your chest.
okay.
You might be thinking also of haptics, which is
Haptics, yeah.
Norwegian, which is from Norway and developed by hearing sighted people. Protactile is a philosophy, a movement, a language that's developing within the deafblind community themselves, starting in your state, in the Pacific Northwest, in
Oh
Seattle.
yeah, there's a big group
And
up here.
yes, exactly. It's the Valhalla for deafblind people. And there in Minnesota, it's really big. And it's only starting to move out here. And what protactile is, the philosophy is like touch first. Like touch is our language. We need to be touching. When you speak to someone in protactile, you never stop touching them. In
Yeah.
tactile sign language, when I'm interpreting for someone in tactile sign language, I will sign into their hand. Then, when they're signing to me, we stop touching and they just signed ASL, which is a visual space, where protactile is a tactile space. So I might be using their
Oh,
chest, their leg, their back, their arm, and like this is in haptics too, is like the nodding of the head, which is, Kayla's doing that for me right now, nodding her head, which is back channeling, giving me
yeah.
information that, oh, I understand. Yeah, I acknowledge that. I get that. If you're deaf blind, you're not seeing that. So what you do is like you take the open hand and just like kind of tapping the arm or tapping the leg, which is the nodding of the head. Uh-huh,
Yeah.
uh-huh, uh-huh. And then hold it. You grab and tighten, which means hold a second, I want to say something, or taking your fingers and kind of like lifting them up like an octopus on your arm or leg or back, which is laughing. So I get
Yeah.
like back channeling that, oh, this person's laughing at what I said. But then protactical will be, so I'm putting my hands on my chest. Tell me if I'm clear on
Yeah, no,
verbalizing
you're doing
this.
great.
Okay,
I was
so,
gonna say I love all the little signs that you keep doing.
uh,
Most people listen to the podcast, but anyone who's gonna watch it on YouTube,
oh, okay. Oh,
you'll get
I
some.
should have worn a black
No, I love
black
your
shirt or
shirt so
something.
much.
This is my old dog. She passed away a long time ago, but it's my dog Sophie.
That is the cutest shirt
So
ever.
like for example, if I'm signing to a deaf blind student in a class and they're talking about a bar graph. So my hands are on my chest. I do one bar graph on the right side of the chest. It's along here. Then I take my finger, I point over here, and then another one lowering. Then I'm showing the numbers of the people going down, and my hand is going across my chest in the downward thing. So they're experiencing, oh, this downward trend of those percentages. Or I'm talking about this group of people. People, I'm
Yeah.
taking the sign for people I'm doing in the air, that's ASL. For a deaf blind person, you do it on the chest. And so I'm doing the sign for people on their chests, showing many bodies. So these people, they walked and they migrated. So I'm taking those people that I put on the right side of my chest, my fingers are touching the chest, and I'm moving it to the left side of the chest to show this migration of these people that we've already established.
Yeah.
And so it becomes this tactile space on there. And now Protactile is starting to develop its own vocabulary separate from ASL. It's like rooted in ASL, but it's also separate from ASL, like bathroom. The sign for bathroom is the T letter, and you shake it like in the air. In ASL, that's bathroom, toilet.
Yeah.
In protactile sign language, and this could be done on the back, on the arm, on the leg, because it doesn't matter where the tactile, it's touch. It's not about
Yeah.
where it is. You kind of do a movement across, like a little straight arrow pressed into, I'm doing it on my chest, across, and then like you're flushing a toilet, down, up, down, up. So across, down, up. That
Oh,
means
cool.
toilet, like I'm going to the toilet. And then if I'm doing environmental feedback on the person, like if you're doing tactile or protactile with someone in the front, you might have a second interpreter doing environmental feedback on the
Yeah.
back so that the person is, oh, they're listening to the teacher, but they also want to know what's happening in the room. Oh, these people over here are talking. So we have some talking there. This will be done on the back. And then, oh, this person just won't. And, left, opened the door and left the room. And the deafblind person has the right to ignore it or pay attention to that, but that's environmental feedback. But again, in protactile, you never stop touching the other person. Even if you're sighted, you don't stop touching them,
Yeah.
which can be a little bit hard because I remember John Lee Clark insisted I use protactile with him, and he's like right up in my face to
Yeah.
like get do the protactile on my body. And for me, at that point, I knew less than I do now to do it with him, but I can't actually see his hands because he's so close to me. So I'm having to rely on tactile myself a bit with him, with that. Anyway, it's a fascinating new
It is.
language. Like for people that are interested in linguistics, this is like a developing language now, and it's so worth reading again. His book, Touch the Future, it came out last year. It's absolutely amazing and is much better explaining all of this and what are good protocols with the deaf blind. Uh, and he's deaf blind of deaf blind. When a person is deaf of deaf, meaning they're a deaf child of a deaf adult, they tend to be much better with language because
Yeah.
they don't have language deprivation from a hearing family not learning sign language, which, as you know, most hearing
Yeah.
families 95% don't learn sign language. Therefore, the child will have no language until they go to school. Um, he's deaf blind of deaf blind, which almost never happens. So he had a deaf blind father. So he is so rooted in this sense, this being of deaf blind, but also the language of deaf blindness. And he's just brilliant. So definitely big recommend there.
That is awesome. Yeah, I went to a protactile workshop a few years ago. Must have been, yeah. So it was probably just like 3 or 4 years ago. And it was a group of people who live in the Seattle area. And they were three people, all deaf blind. And then there was about like six interpreters around. And so it was, they were the ones leading the protactile workshop. And I mean, it was so great. But one of the best parts was that the three of them, whoever was talking or like presenting, they would be signing, and the other two people would have their hands on the speaker's hands. And then the interpreter would be interpreting, but then there would be people giving them the environmental background. Is that what you said?
Feedback, environmental feedback, I think.
Feedback. Like on their backs. And so, like, you could see when people left, when people laughed, when people nodded, if someone raised their hand. And I mean, just like any other presentation of that, everybody was actively engaging, everyone was learning, there was communication. Um, and I wouldn't even say everyone knew sign language who was there. It was people who were working with kids. They were like educators and service providers, parents. Um, and one of my favorite activities that they had us all do was sit in a circle, and all of our legs had to be touching the person next to us,
Mhm.
which was like very common when I was working with adults who are deafblind, that I like, yeah, our legs would be touching. It was like a very like physically close conversation. So they had us all like close to each other. And so the people who aren't used to working in the deafblind community, I mean, you could see just like how uncomfortable they got. Like it was like people were being like their social bubble was like being invaded, or their personal space bubble. And and then they had us it was like, I think one deaf-blind presenter person was trying to get a woman to take off the blindfold. So there was like some sort of activity we did, but he wasn't going to take it off her like himself. And he kept, like signing and miming, like communicating to her. And he would like, hand with hand under hand, like bring her hand up to her mask. And then he would like, bring it up to his face and like explain to like take it off. And so then she would go back to her face and just like not take off the mask, but do the motion. And it lasted for like 5 minutes of like, it felt like 5 minutes. It was probably just like a minute, but he was so patient, and he just took the time to keep explaining it. And I felt like it was such a great example of like, I mean, just, oh gosh, everything, like it made me think back to what you were saying of like, don't just assume that they understand. And it makes me think of like, don't just do something for them so they like don't get to learn. Like, I mean, there's just so many areas that my brain is going. Um,
I
And I,
love that you actually experienced that because you actually, more than most interpreters on the East Coast, like I took the very first deafblind protactile workshop last year that was ever offered on the East Coast.
yeah,
And the fact that you've been to a protactile workshop is amazing. And also that part you were talking about, because I experienced that. Now, I'm someone that's worked with the deafblind more recently, in the last couple of years, like intensely, like one of my major jobs right now is working with the deafblind. But, over the years, but when I did that workshop and we're talking to people and the head of the workshop is like, oh, you guys always have to be touching each other when you're talking, even if you're all sighted and hearing, you have to be touching each other. And it was at first was agony for me because I
yeah,
am someone that like, oh, I want some distance. I don't want to be touching people that I don't know that I don't really want to be touching. That touch is like but what happened is that was the first night. By the second day, it was just normal. It was just
yeah,
normal. Like being really touching because that's where the information is coming in. And it's just like, oh, wait, I got to shift my brain from this visual thing that I'm doing. And that where you were talking about them almost doing like what's on first, who's on second thing
yeah,
with the mask thing, uh, is adjusting the brain to be like, okay, what is happening with the touch?
yes,
Again, with like where I was describing on my chest, where, oh, up here is higher percentage, higher number, higher position. Down here is lower, a decrease. Like, oh, knowing what that means. They also did in our workshop where they had us do co-navigation work. Co-navigator is a person that might probably does sign, but their job is to co-navigate with the deafblind person through the world. It
yeah,
used to be called an SSP, special service provider. So I
yes.
was I was mixed up the SSP,
No,
special
you're right.
service provider. That's
I
right.
think so. Yeah.
But now it's called a co-navigator.
I did not know that. I did not know about that.
Yes, or CN, the
Yeah,
abbreviation will be CN. And they showed us how to co-navigate with the deaf person in like showing them, oh, like, there's a door. Again, there's a door, physically kind of doing this little gesture on the body that they could feel. This is the bathroom, like how they touch their way around. What are like the landmarks that they can touch to know, okay, that there and go around with them. And it was like really, really interesting. But when the deaf blind people who are all still signing and using their protactile slightly differently, because it's not a monolith yet. And
yeah,
this is like the tricky thing is like, I'll work with the deaf blind people and I'll be like, oh, do you use protactile? And they're like, yeah, but I don't use it like those other people. This is my version of it.
yeah.
And so there'll be this like, kind of
Well,
like this battle of whose protactile is going to win out.
yeah. Well, and I tell people all the time, it's kind of like not like accents, but just like the different regions and cultures or like upbringings and bias. Like everybody has their own opinions on things. And so it's like, when I'm talking to someone and if I say a word in a different way and it's like, oh, why'd you say it? Yeah, it's like one of those, but I feel like that also happens in the deaf culture. Like they'll or like just the difference of signing. Like I've talked to some, and I wanted to talk about the deaf culture because you got to experience it at a college, which I think is so amazing. And I would have loved that opportunity going to college um, at a deaf at Gallaudet University. Um, but the first, like the directness and like the honesty in the deaf and deafblind world, I absolutely love. But the signing of like how different it is, like when people are around like a bunch of signers, like okay, so when I first learned sign language, they talk about like the sign language box and how you want to keep it like in this area. But a lot of beginners will like, they go to like sign their name and they're like moving their hand a lot. They're like K-A-Y-L-A. And it's like, and then the person trying to read it's like, what's happening? And so then you are supposed to like sign in this box. But then the more that you like sign gosh, just like the differences. But when I would talk to like people who are deaf people who have been like signing all their life, and how quick they sign, like in a very small box, is very intimidating for me as I usually am signing with kids. But gosh, I totally lost my train of thought. But just like the deaf culture is what I'm trying to get at. What was it like being a hearing person going into like the deaf culture at Gallaudet?
Well, it was so different because I knew sign language much less than I do now. And as you know, because you've studied sign language, it's way harder to receive sign language, to understand it, than it is to express it. It's
Yeah.
you learn how to express it, and then you go through this period of like, what are they saying? And then like learn how like deaf people do with hearing people to fake nod, like, yeah, I understand, and you really don't understand. It's like,
I feel like deaf people don't let you do that. I've had deaf
oh
people be
no, they
like,
will.
"What did I just sign?" And I'm like, "Oh God."
Well, they might know someone is like early on or something like that, but I was really good at it. I was really good at faking it at first, because they were like, psh, 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 and I was a
Yeah.
pretty good expressive, and so they might think I knew more than I did, and I would just be like, I have no idea what they're saying. And then also, like what you were describing, how there's different regionalisms, all that. There's also like fully different signs. Like in the New York area. So this is slow. I'm doing the sign slow, which is one hand pulling back on the other hand, the flat of one hand pulling back slowly on the back of the other hand. But in New York, this is also slow, which is a Y hand going down the side of the
Oh,
face. And then there's certain areas that use this as slow, which is like kind of more, I think, probably mentally slow. But well, like yeah, or that's
yeah.
like deaf, like really bad deafness. But those are all signs for slow in this area, like fully different signs. And then so you have, oh, the different regionalisms, the different vocabulary. Uh, but then there's also how, oh, this person also has cerebral palsy. This person is old. This person signs in this way. And then the mind of the new signer is like, it took me over a decade to realize this little fact. There's not one right way to sign something,
Yeah.
and like your mind is like, what's the right way to sign that? It's like, there's not one right way to sign something.
And I
There
actually
might be
feel like that's
some,
why a lot of beginners in sign language get so frustrated because they're like, "No, you're doing it, like," or they're like, "Your thumb is too far out on that A." And it's like, I don't know, that's just where my thumb is, man.
yeah,
Like,
exactly. It's also like you'll meet deaf people or hearing people that are really fluent. That's You might have a deaf person that is missing their hand. Yet you can
yeah,
still understand them because remember, ASL is a hugely contextual language. So much is based on what the two of you know between each other, what's happening in the room. This is why like video interpreting is much less successful than in-person interpreting, and why I think it shouldn't be used in hospitals
yeah,
because deaf people hate it, especially in the hospital situation. But it's so contextual. But you don't necessarily need your fingers to be able to sign. It's really helpful, but you don't have to. And so it's like different than spoken language in that way because there's all this other stuff that's going in there. Anyway, I tried to get into some of this stuff in the book, but there was just the book initially was 800 pages long,
oh
and
yeah.
I
I
cut it in half.
mean,
It was yeah, it was
because
long.
it is kind of a, or how many pages did it
It's
end up being?
414, I think it ended up
Okay.
being.
Well, I feel like because I mean I read it, I don't know, whenever it came out, I read it like right away because I was so excited about it. And I feel like you did such a good job with like like showing the interpreter and how the interpreter is trying to like be this non-biased, like this neutral party, but then all of a sudden is seeing that like other people aren't treating um the deaf-blind character with respect and like not giving him all the information that he should be getting and like just I just felt like you described that so well and I feel like that is something that happens so often, especially just
All the
in the
time.
disabled world in general
Yeah.
that like I mean, and I even wrote down like it's like this battle of like presume competence versus like don't assume that they could just do anything and like move on. Like you still have to make sure that there's understanding, but like also give them all the information. Like it's yeah,
Yeah.
just such a battle that I feel like people go, but I felt like just yeah, and you went over like the interpreter role just so well that I mean, that was like, I just loved how you did it. But I
Oh,
kind of feel
thank
like,
you.
did you feel like it was you were like the interpreter? Like, did you kind of base that character off of
Oh
you a little
yeah, it's
bit?
a fairly big. I mean, I made him tall and red hair just to make him different than me, but that's pretty much the only thing that's really different. I mean, what's interesting is I've had deaf friends that were like, I didn't know this happened, as far
Yeah.
as the other side, where they get to learn like what's happening in the interpreter side that they didn't know about, which was like really kind of fun. So it wasn't just hearing sighted people learning about the deaf blind, it was also like the deaf learning about, oh, what's happening in the interpreter world, because you really are kind of like in that middle
Yeah.
spot, and there's all this it's like it's also like where I showed that in the book where like the deaf person is saying these things that would be considered incredibly inappropriate in the hearing world.
Yeah.
I had a really interesting thing happen on a job where I'm going to again speak in just a general term, but where it was a training program of a certain sort, and the deaf person said something that was very considered very bigoted to
Yeah.
a certain group, um, and they said it in a way that in the deaf world it may not have been considered bigoted, like if
Yeah.
you're just like regular deaf world, because they're so descriptive about,
Yeah.
what someone looks like or who someone is to get the information about who they are. And he said this in front of a counselor at this training program, and I, as the interpreter, was like, do I do cultural mediation here? And like kind of like phrase this in a way that is less blunt. Like what what happens in the book in a certain thing, knowing the intention, but also this is a training program. And
Yeah.
so who knows what interpreter this guy will have out in the world when he goes for an interview. And so I chose to voice it. This isn't what he said because I won't do that. That would be unethical. Just say you have a giant lump on your shoulder, like a carbuncle. You have a huge carbuncle on your shoulder.
Uh-huh.
Uh, no, that's not a good thing. It's like something like racist.
I mean, I have an example actually. I have had people say that they're like, "Oh, it smells really bad because of this cultural neighbor that I have."
Exactly.
And
Thank
they
you.
will and they will say like the culture that they are from, and then
Beautiful,
they really
beautiful.
do put
That's
it that
exactly it.
all of that culture makes bad smelling food. And it's like a very black and white
Right.
idea, and it was something, and this was a person that I worked with a lot that I really had to go into detail because it was that he grew up with two hearing parents, and there just wasn't, they didn't give him a lot of information. And so yeah, it was, which is, it's like kind of fun as a hearing person. Not fun. That's probably a bad, not a good way to look at this, but it was really interesting to learn from deaf and deafblind people, their perspective on life when a lot of their information was like limited by their
Well,
parents,
in that situation,
caregivers.
so as the interpreter, I had to say, okay, do I do some like kind of cultural mediation here? Like say, hey, you may want to like couch that in a different way because that might be taken rude in this situation. Like if it was an interview, I possibly would say like, hey, are you sure you want to say that? Because they might take it this way. I might actually
Yeah.
do, this is the sign, which is like throwing something under the table, for them to like, hey, do you want to say that? You can. I'll voice that for you. But just know in their culture they might be offended by that.
Yeah.
Um, in this situation, I'm like, okay, what do I do? This is a training program. This is his counselor. And so I voiced it. These people from a certain cultural group, they all have bad smelling food, and so I just voiced it that way. That wasn't what happened, but like
Yeah.
it was like this a similar thing. She ended up setting up a cultural sensitivity thing for the entire school, all of this. He was furious at me. He's like, why didn't you cover it up? Why didn't you like schmooze it? Like, zhuzh it rather. Why did you say it like that? I'm like, because this is a training program. She's your counselor. This is why I did it. He complained to the agency. He complained there, da, 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 complained with me constantly. He still asked for me to be his interpreter, by the way, because it wasn't that
Yeah.
he was mad at me, but he also knew I was a good interpreter. So
Yeah.
he wanted that, but it was like that was the thing that goes on inside of an interpreter is, okay, what's the ethical thing to do here? What's the appropriate thing? How does the message get across? But you
Yeah.
sometimes have these conflicts that you don't really learn in your interpreter training program,
I
like when
mean, you
something like
can't.
that happens.
It would
You
be
know,
impossible to
well,
learn.
there
Like, I
used to
mean,
be
because
a time where they would say just interpret it straight, just do that. That's not always the right thing to do.
yeah.
Yeah.
Because I mean, interpreters do, and especially in the deafblind world, it was a lot of that, like SSPs and interpreters would like fall, they would like switch jobs. And it's like, that's not what you're supposed to do. Like, there are certain jobs, but it's like if a person can't get help, like get the SSP support, like that, or I guess I was like I wasn't either of those roles, but like I would come in to support them with a very specific thing. But then while I'm there, like I would be helping them, um, like preparing food, like teaching them how to meal prep for the week or something. And then they'd be like, "Hey, I also got all this mail and my SSP was sick this week. Can you help me through the mail?" And it's like, "Okay, well, I mean, I'm not supposed to, but yeah, sure. I guess I'm gonna do this really quick because like I also want to support you." Um,
Yeah,
which I
rule
feel
number
like
one is don't be a dick. If someone is like,
I feel like that's
there's,
the rule for everyone, right?
yeah, yeah. No, I actually learned that from a deaf woman. She was like the head of some, uh, I don't know, organization. It was in Hawaii, I remember, and I can't remember where she was from. She was amazing, and she was just talking about the interpreter's role and like, that whole deaf heart thing is like. If someone has a pile of mail there and they're stuck and they really need something, it's not your role, but sometimes don't be a dick.
Yeah,
Just help them fucking read their mail. If you have the time, if it's not like something that is somehow overstepping, and there are times where it's like, I'm not going to answer this test for you.
yeah,
Kind of not going to, that's not my role. That would be unethical because I'm also working for the hearing person. But like, oh, hey, your foot's caught in a hole. I'm not going to, well, I'm sorry. I'm an interpreter. I'm not
yeah,
like an archaeologist to pull your foot out of the hole. Pull the fucking foot out of the hole. It's just like
yeah.
basic common sense and kindness and decency. And interpreters need to do that as well. It used to, do you know about what was it called? The machine model of interpreting? I think it was something
No.
like in the 70s or late 70s where an interpreter's role is just to interpret everything exactly in ASL, disregarding whether the person understood you or not. Like, for those of you that don't understand, when I'm interpreting, there might be several different ways of interpreting something depending on the sign language skill of the deaf person. Again, they don't all speak ASL. They may not speak ASL at all, and then
Oh,
you should
that
probably
that
have
is
a
like a whole other
yeah.
that's like a
Then
whole
you
other
should pull in a
3 hour
deaf interpreter to
conversation.
work with them. But if they don't have it, you don't sign up. This when I was first
That's
doing
like a
medical.
frequently asked question
Yeah,
on
but like
that training.
allergy. This is like allergy. You point to your nose, and then disagree, meaning allergic. Most deaf people I meet in New York that like are immigrants and this and this, they don't know that sign. So you're like, oh, hey, like, like medicine bottles, you take it and then you start scratching and you get like
Yeah.
hives. You have to like do this like expansion. Like for those that are just listening, I just did this like
Oh, I'm
scratching
gonna
my
tell
arm
them
and okay.
everybody just needs to now stop the audio, go watch the video.
It's just that you have to like realize when you're doing sign language that they're not necessarily going to understand traditional standard ASL all the time. And so you go in there, hearing interpreters are not supposed to speak to the patient before the doctor comes in. Bad move for the sign language interpreter because you don't know what kind of sign they use. You don't know what extra
Yeah.
expansion they'll need or anything like that. So you're like, hey, what's up? What's your name? My name's this. Like, what's going on? Da, da, da. I had one time I went in, they're like, oh, this person, they clearly, had a stroke or something like this, da da da. And you go and you start talking to me like, they have cerebral palsy. Why didn't they tell me this person had cerebral palsy? And like
Yeah.
you ask them, they're like, oh yeah, they have cerebral palsy. at that situation, the doctors and the nurses didn't know. They
Yeah.
just thought they had a stroke. They didn't realize that this person had cerebral palsy, but you can see how they're signing like that, and then you clarify with them, and you're like, oh, so I need to be
Yeah.
working with someone that has that kind of way of communicating. Anyway, so you have to
Oh,
talk to them. You have to know what
yeah.
they're, uh,
No, this is
yeah.
like re-inspiring me to like keep signing with my kids. I used to when I just had one, and then once I got to two, I'm like, oh no, this is too hard. But this is really making me want to like keep, because this is the only other language I know is American Sign Language. And so, well, and
You,
like kind of English. But I want them to also know sign language because I feel like a lot of people are used. I love that it's like being used as like baby sign language, and I'm like, let's just keep it going, you guys. Like, why
uh,
stop now? Okay, before we go to the cat tarot card reading, I would love for you to talk about your second book. If you could just give us like a little
sure. Oh,
summary or
I should have
intro
done. I
or
didn't realize this was going to be visual. So this is the second book. Can you see the Disco Witches of Fire Island? It might be backwards. I'm not sure.
no,
On
no,
my
it's
screen, it's
it's
backwards. Oh,
it's
it's
not
good.
backwards. Yeah.
Okay, good. And oh, so this is the first book since it's visual. Sign for Home.
Ah,
Uh,
so good.
so
I'm so excited for your second book.
Disco Witches, very different book. Let me just say now, I love both my books, very much equally, but they're completely different books. So take your Sign for Home, put it on the side, keep it there, But the Disco, which is a completely different book, it's a period piece. It's set in 1989 in on Fire Island, which is it's a big island. There's several different communities, but there's two communities that are LGBTQ. And in 1989, that was the height of the AIDS crisis. And it's about a young man named Joe Agabian. He's an Armenian American guy who is his first great love has died, and he goes to Fire Island to try to not forget, but to heal from that, and ends up living in the attic of three older gay men who end up being in a coven of disco witches, a defunct coven of disco witches,
Yeah.
which was a coven of men and women who would create magic on the dance floor in gay clubs around the country, specifically Provincetown and Fire Island. And it's also like a romance about him finding love again, but very much about healing and what it was to fall in love at that period of time. Uh, for any of your younger listeners and viewers, I mean, during that time, if you had an HIV diagnosis, it was assumed you would die,
Yeah.
possibly within 6 months to a year. And to fall in love at that time, which is, the period where I was, just coming out, meant, is this person going to die? Are they going to infect me? And how do you fall in love when that's in your head?
Yeah.
And in the case of this main character, which is based on me, your first lover's passed away and you're just trying to heal from that. And you're like, the last thing you want to do is to fall in love with someone else who's going to die. But how do you function in the world going around in that? So that's kind
Yeah.
of the
Oh,
setting of it.
well, I'm
Uh,
excited. I think you are such a great writer. I loved how you wrote your first book, and it doesn't even need disability representation. I'll still read it.
Thank
But
you
I
very
feel like a
much.
lot of people, and I'm actually doing a couple of interviews later this month for people who identify as disabled and LGBTQ plus, and we're talking about why there's like such a higher, like why once you like accept one identity, why it's easier to accept another one. And we're kind of talking about just the rise of numbers of people who are disabled and LGBTQ plus and people of color.
That's
Um,
so interesting. I mean, that's always been a thought in the deaf world, not in the deaf world among the deaf, but among hearing people that see the deaf world and they're like, is there a higher percentage of LGBTQ people among the deaf? I don't know. I actually was working on an article about that like
yeah,
decades ago, and it could just be because when you see a gay deaf person in a bar, it's like it's a lot more obvious than a hearing person because their hands are flailing around. But it is not rare for me to meet a gay deafblind person, a gay deaf person. It's
yeah,
pretty frequent. But again, I wouldn't. that's not a scientific study, so
There
do
are no
not throw me in that.
scientific studies on
Right,
it. There is
exactly.
no studies. It is all just people's interpretation. And I'm really excited to talk about it with this. He's a friend of mine that I've met through like going through conferences. Anyways, I'm going to shuffle the deck. You can ask a question that's kind of like an open-ended question, or we could just be like, it's a card for your day, your year.
How about a card? I'm just terrified of this. How about a card for my year? What's my year going to be like? Ah,
Okay, let's do it. Tell me when to stop shuffling.
okay. Stop.
Okay, here we go. You got, oh, so cute. The world, that is what it's called. It's a little white cat in a little bowl with, it kind of looks like a plant. Or
What
is it
does
a
that mean?
moon? I don't know. Let's see. I have to get out my book because I don't know. I don't have things memorized at all. So the fun thing is that I'm just gonna read it, what's in the book, and then we get to like basically just interpret it together. I mean, that's pretty much what tarot card people do, but they actually know all the meanings behind the cards, so then they get to like make it all fun and stuff. Okay. Ooh, well, it was upright when I showed it to you. So the words are accomplishment and celebration, which
Love
that's a good
that.
year. It says, after a long journey, she has accomplished curling up in the bowl planter. She has it all. Everything is in balance right now. Enjoy this feeling of enlightenment. Reflect on what it took for you to get here and use that knowledge to pursue your next adventures.
I love that.
I
This
feel
is like
like
my favorite thing. Thank you.
that's so perfect. Because I
Oh
know
yeah.
you've been working so hard on this book. I remember, like, I don't know when you posted this, but I remember you going to like a writer's retreat, because you were saying, I mean, and you said something where you're like, I'm trying to write this book, and like I felt like you felt stuck, and I don't know, was that when you started working on this new book?
Oh, I started working on this new book before I finish the sign for home. It's actually, I know we have to end soon, but um, actually, both of them have the same backstory for the gay character, because I didn't know I would ever be published. So, in the sign for home, if you remember, Cyril has a former lover who dies.
Yeah.
Of cancer, and in Disco Witches is about a guy whose lover who died from AIDS, and it was the same thing. I'm like, well, neither of these books are going to be published, so I'll just use the same backstory for the main character. Who knew? They're both published. No, I'm maybe with that one. I have a third book that I'm just about to hand back to my agent. That I might have been the Siena when I went to Italy. It might have been that writer's residency I went on that I was
I
working
don't
on
remember.
this third book. Uh, but yeah. I don't know. I'm always going away and writing. I'm always writing. That's just like what I do now.
Well,
Writing and interpreting.
that is so cool. I've been trying to write an adult book that's a nonfiction book, and it's just about raising inclusive kids. And it's been all year, and I'm like 4 chapters in. I keep
But you
trying
have
to.
two kids, for God's sake.
No, I know they're so great, but it's like these little my this area is like how I keep myself sane, that I have this area that is not me being a mom.
Right.
Because
Yeah,
yeah,
you got to
they're
protect that, right? You got to like,
ah,
I mean,
yes.
know where you are as a writer. I always like talk about this. It was like when I finally like said, I'm putting the writing first, which means different thing for different people. It's like, okay, this time is like sacred. This is when I write.
Yeah.
And I think that's what we all have to do, right?
I was doing that, but like October, November, I mean, once a week's not enough, but once a week was when I would like, my partner would be done with work around like 5, and then he would be with the kids, and then I would just lock myself in the room for like 4 hours and just do as much as I can. And
Wow.
my only break was like to go say goodnight to the kids, but then I'd come back here and just like keep writing. Um, but then I only do it once a week. And then the holidays came, and and we were
Holidays mess everything
traveling, and we
up.
got a dog, and just things got crazy. But now that we're back in January, I'm hoping that I can find my once a week again and keep going, because um, I feel like it's really important, and I just want the information out there. And I don't know why a book form. Who knows? Just
I mean, books are
that.
great.
Why not? Read a couple
Yeah.
children's books. There they are in my background. As you can
That's
see, this is
amazing.
where I store them.
That's so cool. That's so
Um,
cool.
but
Yeah,
yeah,
you're doing a lot and you're doing a lot of good too. Like I love your posts. They're great and I'm glad someone's doing that out there. Yeah, I see
thank
your
you so
posts
much.
probably more than most people. I guess because I click on them a lot.
I
Um,
also post a lot. I'm gonna try to slow down this year. I feel like I got a little obsessed with posting every day, and now I'm like, okay, let's do not as many days, but like stronger content instead of just like all this silly
hmm.
because sometimes they're just like silly random videos,
All I know is
but
that I
still
appreciate them way more than the crap that's been coming on my feed lately, which has been horrible.
all the
I'm taking
negativity.
that cat tarot. I think that was absolutely 100% a prediction. I'm going to take that. I'm going to just like
Yeah, that was a
put it in
really good
here.
one.
It was a really good one. Thank you.
Well, thank you again so much for being here. I
This was a
appreciate you so
joy.
much for taking the time.
Back at you. You have a wonderful day and a wonderful year.
Thank you. You too. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I hope you go and pre-order Blair's new book, Disco Witches of Fire Island, as I am so excited. And we forgot to mention that when you pre-order that book and share the receipt with Alcove Press, which I will put everything in the show notes, you'll get like a sticker and then a signed placard from Blair Fell. So make sure you pre-order. He is going to be doing a book tour. So if you're not following him on Instagram to get all the latest deets, what are you doing? I follow him and I love getting any sort of updates with his books. He is such a phenomenal writer, and I hope you enjoyed our conversation. Have a great day. Inclusion starts with you, and I just want to help.